I've got Mark Cameron here. You know, he's the man when Acton represents the rural sector. Somebody I find absolutely qualified for this job. He is a real fair dinkum cowcocky, and he knows exactly what it is to be a farmer and to experience the wrath of this government. Now, Mark, thanks for coming on, mate. I really appreciate that. And look, I believe you had a bill come out, and it was about to be debated in the House. What actually happened?
Oh, look, I've actually had two pieces of legislation. The one legislation, Max, and it is good to see you. Always good to have a good yarn and sort of iron out the kinks in this crazy government. Yeah, look, I had a members' bill. It was drawn, and it spoke to giving some power and oversight over freshwater concerns, farming concerns, actually, back to councils, because what we've seen is this big government assume that it can, centrally plan out of Wellington. And what we sort of figured out, it was not the government by virtue of trying to do the right thing, wasn't defining the problem. And then the laws that followed, or proposed laws that followed, weren't proper solutions by virtue of that. So I had a members' bill that gave oversight over regulatory framework for freshwater concerns and on-farm methodologies back to council, back to stakeholders, and back to industry at the farm gate. And I can tell you hand on heart that Minister Parker walked past me in the House before the bill was even debated, once being drawn, and said he wouldn't be supporting it. Now, I think there's a real disdain there, because as we know, as people that design laws, that we want fair and honest debate and dialogue. And that would normally involve, 3 readings and a select committee process and a committee stage, none of which was going to happen when a minister has such an animus to rural New Zealand as that. And that was illustrative of that the very point I've just made. Sadly, that bill was voted down in the first reading, and it didn't give the farmers the oversight into finding tailored solutions at a farm gate, with industry, and I think that's a travesty.
Do you know what? We all appreciate, Mark, that you're up against it. The numbers are really, really stacked against you. But the fact you stood up, you made a big effort. You've put a bill through. It was drawn. I think that, we do appreciate what you do. And you're a gladiator against the majority. And look, thank you for that at least. But you said there's more than one bill you've put up. There's a second one you've done.
Yeah, look, Max, I'm in the process of framing another one up with the drafters office at the moment, and that's to do with actually giving property owners some surety. Now, and some property owners and people listening today will be aware of this. There's conversation around, or predicated around, the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity. And what that speaks to is that councils working with local iwi and local community have to identify, under this prescription, this NPS, ecologically or biologically sensitive areas on private land. And quite often, by virtue of that, there will be prescriptions on what land owners can do on their private land, because, argument's sake, for this, for the sake of conversation, there's a stand of cockatiel or cowrie snails that have been identified, or there's an area on private land where it has a monolithic rock feature that is being identified as significant. What the councils, by virtue of this prescription coming out of central Wellington, have done is put prescriptions on what we can all do on our land. I've introduced, or in the framework of, the process, of introducing framework around, should that happen and should this legislation become law, that farmers and landowners be compensated for the removal of that land from their normal daily activities. So
you know what, Mark, to me, that's a complete violation of somebody's rights. You think that you block a land, you belong to it. And the more and more as time goes by, because I've been around for a few decades, but, we seem to be losing every piece of what we thought was our own piece of land. So, look, I understand it, but for a farmer who makes a living off that land and to have it taken from them, I would have thought it would have been automatic payment and compensation for that. Look, I thought that's what always it was.
Excuse me, certainly not that I'm privy to, but I want to make damn sure that there is some representation in terms of, one, acknowledging the erosion of the private property rights. And I think we've got to look at this as a sum of all parts game. Most private property right owners, whether they're lifestyle blocks or owners or farmers, a conservationist in their own mind. So they're going to invest in their own land. This government approach is backwards logic. It really is arse about face when you're coming to, to the narrative that the government has to come and with this big stick, tell council that you have to spatially map private land and then identify these significant areas and change the way people function on their own land. We think there's a better way to do it. The ACT Party's actually created this contestable fund, $10 million per year that you access through your council. And if you wanted to further invest in such things as the Queen Elizabeth's Trust, which so many people have done on private land, you could do so, by virtue of which lifting your own private property value. We've seen what's happened in the United Kingdom, where such a similar scenario has been created over there by virtue of a partnership between private owners and local councils or local boroughs. There has been further investment into ecologically sensitive areas on private land, and it's driven the land price up rather than this big stick approach that we're going to take it off you.
Well, I tell you what, it just sickens me the fact that it actually dictate to you what you're allowed to do on your land, but let alone, I can see your point. Look, if we got to compromise, if we got to give up something, well, at least compensate us for what losses we're going to have. What comes to mind though, Mark, is, look, I understand a dairy farmer lost a heap of substantive land that he might have been grazing or she was grazing. But I often think about, there's a lot of people now growing manuka, saying, well, that's great for the bees and we're gaining good revenues out of manuka honey, which is obviously turning back to scrub, and there's a bit of gorse and mixed all amongst all that. Will that also be, purloined or changed or perhaps dictated to what they're allowed to do with it?
Correct. And I can offer you an anecdote, which you've sort of touched on just by your own example there. And it was Kanuka and Manuka, where a private property owner intentionally spent significant amounts of money to do the very thing, to re-forest, I suppose, with natives, a section of his farm.
Which should be applauded, which should be congratulated.
Absolutely. And by virtue, he had multiple revenue streams. So he was still farming, of course, and then he had this another revenue stream, which was ultimately going to be bees. Under the prescription as prescribed, should the methodology be adopted by the local government through SNOs, significant natural areas, they were going to put a ring around the whole property and literally put prescriptions on what he could and could not do. Now, he'd already invested in it, he'd already fenced off these areas and spent, I believe, near on $500,000 on this native plantation. And by virtue, the council, at the instructions, at the behest of the government, they said now that is being prescribed under the banner of significant natural area. And this chap was deeply aggrieved. He said, I'm already doing this stuff. I don't need the government to come and browbeat me doing it.
Mark, what can we do to support you? I mean, we'd love to see this bill when it comes out, but more importantly, some of these, the language you use here will be over our heads, but we now understand the meaning of it. So, you'll find that you've got a lot of support from people watching this video. What can we do to help?
People are naturally apathetic. I mean, we've got to get people engaged in the conversation. At the end of the day, we're all 1/5 millionth of the narrative. And if you don't like the direction of travel, I think it's incumbent upon Kiwis to get involved to a more or lesser degree, should they see fit, in the politics of their backyard. The landscape in our lives is changing, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us having a better tomorrow than today. And I think it's important for us to weigh in what that looks like, have a frank and open conversation and debate, and be part of the better solution finding and outcomes out the other side.
Well, I tell you what, anyone watching this, if you can think of a good idea that can help. Now, what comes to mind, and I've only just thought of this, but Mark, I make you an offer that if you've got a farmer out there, and I'm sure you'll have dozens of them, who is actually suffering under this and have got personal examples, if they put a video up of a bit of their land, then come and have a chat to me online like you are. I'm happy to actually promote it and put it up and saying this is a real life example of somebody who's potentially having something taken off them.
Absolutely.
All right, Mark, thank you very, very much. And thanks for your contribution. Let's have you back more often. This was fantastic. But we need people like you around here. And look, thank you very much for your contribution in Parliament. You're doing a great job.
Thank you, Max. Absolute pleasure.